been 4 years since I've been able to do that. It's great to see you all. Thank you for being here today. I want to thank our speakers for being here. Thank the staff. We have Nicole Potter up front here, who may be new to many of you. Kim Nelson in the back, myself, David Richards. Is there anything you need today, can't find, just let us know. We'll do the best we can to serve you. Thank Heritage House for being here today. And thank you, the guests, for being here. It's been a long trip since 2019 when we were last able to do this in person. That year we commemorated the centennial of women getting the right to vote, the ratification of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. And we had a great turnout. We had 90 people. And that was in October of 2019. And 5 months later, COVID came here. And we had already had plans for the 2020 Maine town meeting in place, but we had to scrap them and go to Zoom, which is really the format that we've had to use for the past 3 years. So this is the first time we've been able to have this group together in person here at the library, and we're very pleased to see you. We tried to do it hybrid last year, and what we found is if you give people the option of Zoom or coming in person, 3/4 of them will choose to do it via Zoom. And we really wanted to see people come back to the library. So thank you for making that choice to be here today. And we really feel that this is the spring where life is getting more back to normal. Small signs of that. This is the first spring where school groups were able to come without wearing face masks. We actually took down one of the pieces of plexiglass on the front desk so we can more easily exchange with people. So we have these very slow signs of getting back to normal. We're very pleased to see that. It's been a very busy spring. It's going to be a very busy year here at the library. I'll talk more about that as we wrap up the day. So logistics, I think most of you have heard. If you need the restrooms, they're down the hallway over on this side. And most of you have discovered the food is over down on this hallway. And when we have lunch, we'll give you plans to how to work your way down there in one direction so you can come up the other direction in the hallway and we don't have people colliding in the middle of the hallway going in both directions. The other thing that I should always remind people is if you have cell phones, make sure they're silent so they don't go off unexpectedly in the middle of one of the presentations today. And if you need water, there's bottles of water right next to the front desk. So I think that's all the logistical and welcoming things I had to say today. And now it's time to introduce our first speaker, Professor James Melcher from the University of Maine at Farmington. I don't know, his slide was up earlier and it had some of his basic biographical information. He's a professor of political science at UMaine Farmington. He's been there since 1999. And he is also the pre-law advisor. And I've known Jim so long, I don't even remember how long I've known him. He's been a great friend to the library over the years. He's had us come over and speak at UMaine Farmington on occasions. But one of the memories I most comes to mind about Jim is, it turns out 16 years ago, the University of Maine at Farmington, to fulfill the federal requirement that if a school receives federal funding, they have to do something to commemorate Constitution Day, which is in September, commemorating when the United States Constitution was ratified. What UMaine Farmington started doing is having Professor James Melcher give a lecture every year on Supreme Court cases from the previous term. And I went to one of those, and it was classic Jim Melcher, which you... I hope that's a good thing. We'll let people decide whether it's a good thing or not, but it definitely will be memorable. He does a brilliant job of taking these very complex cases and summarizing them in 5 to 10 minutes. So we are going to take a whirlwind tour of some cases from the previous term. Now, usually in September, I think September is about when the new term of the Supreme Court begins. So that's why he's looking at the previous term. But because we're meeting in May, the Supreme Court has already heard many of these cases and is starting to hand down some rulings. So he actually had me change the placement of one of the court cases because there's now a ruling on it. So now it goes from one that goes into the list that has been ruled on rather than one where we're awaiting an opinion. So that's what he will do. He will give us these summaries of, I believe it's 7 cases.
It is.
And hopefully you will be entertained and informed, not necessarily in that order. Professor James Melcher.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's get everything back up here. Being very conscious of energy, everything shut off, so let's see. Betty. There's nothing like trying to type in your password with 100 people watching you.
Lowercase, Jim, lowercase.
There we go. No, I am all set. Have I got all my microphones on where you want them? Okay. I'll clip this in. I feel like I'm one of those people speaking at some press conference with, 400 microphones in front of them. And there, will that do?
That should.
All right. Very, very good. I'll try not to sneeze or do anything too untoward on these things, and I trust someone will let me know if I am running over my time. I will try not to filibuster today. Not one of the prettier elements, yes, you can have that, of the Congress. So first off, let me say it's an honor to be back here. I was very privileged to be the speaker here, I think it was in 2012, talking about Margaret Chase Smith and American politics. And it's been great working with David and the other people here over the years. I think Margaret Chase Smith would be tremendously impressed with how her library has continued her legacy, continued getting people talking about politics in a way that is civil and interesting. And it's hard to talk about cases before the Supreme Court in a way that's civil and interesting because we get into all these kinds of issues like abortion and religion and the Hidden Commerce Clause. Well, maybe that one doesn't get you quite as excited. Maybe it leaves you more dormant. It's also called the Dormant Commerce Clause. Hopefully you will not be dormant by the end of this and you'll all be having to sleep and David will have to use his little Jeopardy-like clicker to let you know. As David said, I give a talk every year called the Supreme Court Preview and Review. It's open to the public. It's usually shortly after Constitution Day in September, just before the new term of the Supreme Court starts. First Monday of October, I believe, is when they started, and a lot's changed on the Supreme Court. I'm old enough, I hit one of those big round birthdays earlier this year. I was born when Kennedy was president. I'm old enough to remember a movie called First Monday in October about the novel idea that there would be a woman on the Supreme Court and be like, wow, that's really radical. That's like science fiction. And, so we've seen a lot of changes on the Supreme Court. Obviously, things have gotten a little bit different over the years, but you're certainly invited to come to Farmington when I give my Supreme Court preview and review this fall. I always talk about cases of the most recent term and try and anticipate what some of the important cases coming up are. So I'm going to be talking about 7 cases today. 4 of them were from last term. 1 was decided this term, just about 2 weeks ago. We wait for the cows to come home on these things. Here it was waiting for the pigs to come home in the pork producer's case. And there's a bunch of big stuff waiting. The Supreme Court likes to save the most explosive, pundit blathering cases for right at the end. And we've got a whole bunch of them that I don't unfortunately have time to talk about, but I'll be able to talk about a couple of those. So there's going to be watching the Supreme Court in early to mid-June. That's often when they save the big blockbusters that will be coming up. First case we'll talk about is from right down the road, Shurtleff versus Boston. Another case that probably a lot of you know very well, Carson versus Macon. Maine doesn't make the Supreme Court that often. It doesn't have as many bad behaviors on the part of government or other people, and so we tend not to have as many cases as some states, Florida, have that come up on these sorts of things, but this was an important case involving Maine. This is one I hope we can talk about and still all be friends afterward. This is the Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health. This is the Supreme Court ruling that overturned Roe versus Wade and allowed states to put much broader bans on abortion than they had had in the last 40 years. Guns, never controversial. But I'll take a shot at talking about New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin. You might be able to guess which side of the case the Rifle and Pistol Association was on. The piggy case I just talked about, National Pork Producers versus Ross, dealing with what I was taught is called the Hidden Commerce Clause. Other people call it the Dormant Commerce Clause. It's a case of a federal conflict. Does a state's regulation step too far into the commerce power given to Congress to regulate stuff? And we'll wallow around in the slop on that one a bit. Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard and the University of North Carolina, case about affirmative action in college admissions. That's been a major issue before the court since the late 1970s in the Bakke case, long before, well, pretty much everybody on that side was born, maybe before some of your parents were. It's odd being the old guy in the room these days. And then finally, a court case about, it's a conflict in some ways between religious rights, free speech rights, and the rights of LGBT plus people, a case called 303 Creative versus Alanis. I don't know if I'm pronouncing her name wrong, but she's in Colorado, and even though my voice carries quite well, I don't think she can probably hear me in Denver. First off, we have a slightly different court than we had from the early ruling. Stephen Breyer stepped down after many years on the court, having been appointed by President Clinton. And so now we have Ketanji Brown Jackson, first black woman in the history of the Supreme Court. In terms of ideology, this has led to very little actual change on the court. She's in that liberal bloc of justices with Sonia Sotomayor and Elena Kagan, very much in that pragmatic Breyer mold, not quite as radical on a number of things as Sotomayor in particular is, but there's been very little ideological change having her on versus Stephen Breyer. So, the case of the fluttering flag fiasco. This is a case from the city of Boston involving, if you see here, there are 3 flagpoles. One flagpole always has the United States flag, and commonly the POW flag is the black flag you see there. The second flag is the flag of the state of Massachusetts. The third flag is one that is reserved for different groups to talk about different issues. If the Red Sox win the pennant or the Celtics come back from down 3-1 to the Heat, you might see one of those flags. Or if there's some other commemoration or there's a convention in town. That third flagpole is a reserve for temporary displays. It's not something that's always there. And that's going to become very important when I talk about how this ruling was held. The things that are up on that flagpole typically only stay for an hour or two. Long enough to have a photo opportunity, long enough to have some sort of celebration, long enough to get your picture in the paper, and the city allows people to fly on that third one. And so people apply. I mean, you can't just like run down there, down to Government Center, take the red line down and suddenly put up your flag. You have to apply. And it seemed to be that they were grading on a pretty easy curve, easier than I graded Farmington. They got everybody passed, 284 to nothing. Wouldn't you like to win every game that you're in, 284 to nothing? Every single request over, I think it was about a 10-year period, had been approved until these people down here said, we want to fly what is commonly called the Christian flag. The Christian flag is a flag that Protestant Americans founded about 100 years ago. It has a red cross inside a blue field, inside a blue union and a white field. And they are a conservative activist Christian civic group that runs something called Camp Constitution. I don't know if, you sing campfire songs about the Third Amendment at Camp Constitution, paddle over to the other side of the lake. Camp Constitution does a lot of conservative programming. They're a Christian conservative organization, and they said, we want to fly the Christian flag. It's a flag that many Protestant churches have. I just saw the Augusta Symphony Orchestra perform in their venue at South Parish in Augusta. They have that flag up. But it's something that's an unofficial flag that many Protestant places use, and they wanted to fly this flag on that third flagpole. They said, hey, you've approved the previous 284 of them. How about we become number 285? And the city of Boston was worried that there would be a constitutional problem doing this. One of the big themes, and my veteran students all know the word theme means potential essay question. One of the key themes is, and then they start paying attention and wake up and they're no longer dormant, and they start thinking about the all-knowing, all-powerful Commerce Clause. The Establishment Clause says that government cannot establish a religion, and that's been a very controversial element of the Constitution. The Supreme Court has had difficulty agreeing on a single test. Clarence Thomas's ideas about how to deal with this not lined up very well with, say, Sonia Sotomayor's ideas. And the city was afraid we'll be in trouble with the Establishment Clause if we fly the Christian flag. It will look like the city of Boston is endorsing Christianity over other religions. It will look like we're putting our force behind that, and we aren't going to let you do this. So they became the first group that wasn't allowed to fly this. As you might expect, Camp Constitution said, we have two constitutional items in our corner. We have our freedom of speech, and we also have our free exercise of religion. And this isn't a government statement. You guys change this flag every hour. It's not as though people are going to think this is the city of Boston endorsing Christianity over Islam or over Judaism or over anything else. You're interfering with our First Amendment rights. And the First Amendment often works that way. That different groups both see themselves as the proper defenders of the First Amendment, and the city was probably afraid they'd get sued. So one of the key questions here is this speech of a private individual or a private group, or is this the government saying this is what you believe? If the government put up a cross on top of the Maine State House and left it there, that would look like government speech. That would look like the government is proclaiming, this is our official policy. This is who we're behind. The church said, you guys change these flags every hour. Nobody's going to think this is the official position. So that became the key question for the court. Is this private speech or is this government speech? And the flag flutters away. And part of why there are a couple of reasons I wanted to make this case first. One, it's from right down the road, only a few hours away, right down there in Boston. You can stand right there on all the lovely cement at Government Center and look at all of it. But one of the images the Supreme Court has among people is that every decision is 5-4 or increasingly now 6-3. There's a surprisingly large number of cases the Supreme Court is unanimous about. One of the things I would compliment Justice Roberts about is he has been very good at building consensus on a lot of issues. Not the controversial ones or the ones people have strong ideological disagreements about, but it's not as though they're at each other's throat all of the time. Just some of the time, and leading into June, probably 24 hours a day. But Camp Constitution and their leader, Mr. Shurtleff, wins a 9-0 decision. It's one of the last decisions that Stephen Breyer wrote. He's, of course, taught for years at Harvard, knows Boston very well. And the Supreme Court held Shurtleff's First Amendment rights were violated. They said, this isn't government speech. If they had this flag up every day, that would be the government making a statement. But this is a kind of watch this space thing. Like if you drove up on I-95, like I did from Augusta this morning, they changed the messages on those signs regularly. The court said this is clearly a case where they've created a venue for people to air their views about things. This is not government speech, it's private speech. The city was afraid the ACLU and others might sue them for violating the Establishment Clause. This was a case where the American Civil Liberties Union actually weighed in on behalf of the Christian group, said, you're discriminating against their airing things, that this is what is called viewpoint-based discrimination. You're likely to run into a lot of trouble with the First Amendment if you're saying some messages are okay, some messages are not okay. So if the state wanted to say, well, we'll allow billboards again, but only for Democrats, that would be viewpoint-based discrimination, and that's always going to get you in trouble with the court. If it looks like these messages are okay, but we're going to block these, which I think the court correctly in this case saw that they were rejecting a religious message, felt that this was an unconstitutional restriction, particularly since they had gone, did I mention, 284 to nothing, approving everybody. What makes this one different? I remember the electric, one of these things is not like the other ones. One of these things does not belong. And so that's an actual picture of the Christian flag being flown in front of Boston City Hall. This was back in July of just this past year, that after they won the court case, they applied. The city said, okay, you win. You get to have the flag. And so they took lots of pictures and had a lot of prayer and generally had a big victory party over there. On that, and the pattern, I think, clearly showed that there was, in fact, August 2022, it showed there, that's an actual picture of the Christian flag flying for the 1 hour. If you go down there now, you will not see it. The flag is, I don't know what's there now. There'll be, I don't know, some flag for, National Chocolate Bar Week or whatever. So if that wasn't close enough to home for you, I've got one that's even more close to home, the case of Casson versus Macon. This is a rare Supreme Court case from Maine. Now, we've had a few. There was, of all things, an 11th Amendment case about the Cumberland County Jail about a decade ago. There was a case about 20 years ago about the vital, searing issue of importation of golden shiner bait fish into the state of Maine. And the judges could not resist writing all the cheesiest fish puns. There's a fishtail they're telling here. It was, we don't usually wind up in the Supreme Court, but we did in Carson versus Macon. And Carson versus Macon is a court case also dealing with the free exercise and establishment clauses of the First Amendment of the Constitution. Down here, you see one of the parents and one of the children that were involved, and they were fighting against the Maine Department of Education and, by extension, Maine state law. And the question here was, can the state of Maine fund some high schools for students who live in a town with no high school? There are lots of rural towns in Maine that are not part of a high school district. Durham, Maine, I know, was one of these. I think in the case of this, one of the students was from Palermo. There are a lot of places in rural Maine where there is no local high school. And what the state has done is say, we'll pay for you to go to a school of your choice in this area. So when Maine had a case about somebody in Durham a few years ago, they said you could go to Lisbon, you could go to Freeport, you could go to Mount Ararat, or you could go to Brunswick. But they didn't offer them a choice of going to a Catholic school. The parents wanted to send their children to St. Dominic's, which is now in Auburn, which, as most of you know, is a Catholic school in Auburn. They said, well, how come we can only pick from the public schools? And state law said, if we pay to send you to a religious school, we are violating the Establishment Clause of the Constitution because we're providing a lot of money to help support a place with a religious message, and we can't do that. So there are a lot of places in rural Maine that have this issue, and there were 3 families that sued the state. They sued the state seeing a previous ruling seeming to invite rulings in. One of the other themes about the Supreme Court, you all know what that means, right? Potential, I say. Yeah, write this down. Although you do better writing it down if you actually took the cap off of your pen. That was, all right, that was probably not nice of me. One of the themes is by the cases the Supreme Court chooses to take, and the cases that the Supreme Court rules on in a different way are essentially an invitation. hey, now we're really eager to hear this kind of case. Why don't you do this? Little like being in high school and that person you've just been terribly, terribly interested in, going to the Giffords up on, 201, and usually that person just ignores you, and this time they actually make eye contact with you. You say, I'm getting signals that this might go better this time. Be careful how you try this. Well, the Supreme Court sent a major signal to Maine and other places that they were willing to look at this from a much more accommodationist point of view, much more likely to find there wasn't a violation of the Establishment Clause. And it came from a case involving a woman named Espinoza and the state of Montana, which is why they called the case Espinoza versus Montana. As my veteran students know, I always say it's not rocket science, it's political science. That's why they let me teach it. Espinoza versus Montana was a case about a state tax credit in Montana that parents that sent their children to a private school, but not a religious private school, could get a tax break from the state government. Ms. Espinoza wanted to send her children to a Christian religious school, and the state said, no, state law says you can't do that. We have what's called a Blaine Amendment in Montana, named for James G. Blaine, the Continental Liar from the state of Maine, who's buried about a mile from my house in Augusta, that many states enacted legislation in the 1800s that said states can't do anything that supports religion in any way, including religious education. So the state said, our state constitution ties our hands. We can't give money for that. And the Supreme Court, which as you may have heard is a little more conservative than it was 10 years ago, ruled, no, Montana is violating the Espinoza's family's free exercise of religion. If you would pay to send them to a different school, you have to pay to send their kids to this Christian school also. And a lot of these parents who had been consistently losing these cases in Maine court said, oh, I think somebody just said I could go to Giffords with them. I think this will be a sweet outcome. We've had a rocky road up until this point. Thank God Giffords is open in Farmington again. The families involved were from three relatively rural towns in Maine. Glenburn over by Bangor, Orrington south of Bangor, and Palermo just a little ways down the road from us on Route 2. In none of these cases was there a local high school, so they had that state package of either public or secular private schools to pick from. Secular private schools tend to be too expensive for people to send these to. We've seen this going back to the voucher cases from Cleveland 25 years ago. So basically, it's a public school or nothing, and these parents said, we want to teach our children in a Christian environment, and a relatively conservative Christian environment. And the two schools they wanted to send their kids to in the different cases, one was called Bangor Christian Academy, which is a Christian academy in Bangor. And the other is a place called Temple Academy down near Thomas College in Waterville, connected to a conservative Christian church there, alma mater of one of my students, Montana Towers, that is now at Maine Law School. So they were people that were directly affected and said, we want to send our kids to one of these Christian schools. And the state said, state law says we can't give you money to send your kid to a private religious school. So there's another of the set of parents. That's Ms. Macon, was head of the State Department of Education. One thing you will see in a lot of court cases is somebody is named in a court case in their role as leader of an agency or leader of a department. It's not that they're personally suing her and they're going to take her bicycle away if they win. It's in her capacity as director of the State Department of Education. Maine courts had always shot this down. They said, it's real clear. You can give money to religious schools, but the state has chosen not to do so. The state is not under an obligation to send them to religious schools, but did I mention this is a somewhat more conservative court, particularly on religious issues? The Supreme Court ruled 6-3, and I bet you can guess which 6 ruled on one side and which 3 ruled on another. Clue, Thomas ruled with the family. Sotomayor did not rule with the family, and as one of my favorite alumni likes to say, that was a case of shock level 0, that nobody was entirely surprised this came out that way in the wake of the Espinoza decision. The Espinoza decision made it very likely the state of Maine was going to lose, and they did. Most schools don't have this issue. Most schools do not have as much rural territory as Maine. If you're in New Jersey, there's a high school probably within about 3 miles of wherever you are. That's not true in Maine. We have a lot of very rural areas where this has been a very important program. So it's not a case that really has a lot of impact outside of Maine, except for putting more pressure to pay to have students attend religious schools, but it's a very big deal in Maine, and it's still playing out. One of the other themes I always have in talking about the Supreme Court is court decisions aren't a one and done. Oh, that settled everything. Now there aren't any conflicts. A court decision is almost always an invitation to further struggle, in the words of the great journalist Fred Friendly from many years ago. So Maine has still got a fight on its hands about this issue. The state said, okay, we'll open this up. Your school can apply to be one of those schools, ellipsis, ... But we have rules about who gets money from the state. And one of those rules is you can't have discrimination against LGBT plus people in who works in your school or who attends your school. If you're cool with that, we can give you money. But if you discriminate against gay people, you're not getting any money from the state. So only one school applied. Cheverus, which many of you know is a Catholic high school in Portland, said, we don't have that kind of discrimination. We'd like to apply for students to be able to come to Cheverus. And the state said, fine, we will give students money to go to Cheverus who fit into this program. Not every student. Not if you live in Portland where there are already high schools, not South Portland or Westbrook. But if you're in one of these places, we'll be open. But Bangor Christian and Temple Academy said, well, now wait a minute. Aren't you still discriminating against our free exercise of religion? We have beliefs that homosexuality is wrong, that we teach according to our religious precepts, and the state is essentially trying to blackmail us into changing what we believe, and we're not going to do that. So they're now suing the state to say that these restrictions about gay students and gay teachers are a violation of their free exercise rights. So that case is still going on. Okay, those cases were controversial. This one is a little more controversial. And the last time I was here, I was talking about civility in politics. Abortion is not an issue that either side tends to argue in a civil way, but we will try to. You probably know this is the case from Mississippi that overturned the Roe versus Wade decision from the 1970s. Roe versus Wade established first trimester abortions, abortion the first third of pregnancy, as a constitutionally guaranteed right under a right to privacy, which they first held in a case called Griswold versus Connecticut in 1965. Roe overturned the laws of 46 states, including Maine. In 1973, there were only 4 states where abortion was legal under almost all circumstances. Some states would say you can have an abortion if it will otherwise result in the death of the pregnant woman. But essentially, it was all states on the coast. I think it was New York, California, Oregon, and Hawaii. There were no states in the middle of the country where abortion was legal. A wealthy woman could fly to Sweden or another foreign country that had these, but for somebody without those sort of means, abortion was essentially unavailable. And the Supreme Court issued a controversial ruling called Roe. In Roe, which Blackmun wrote as a former lawyer for the Mayo Clinic, he was largely thinking about the rights of doctors. And he said, I want to do this in a way that recognizes medical decisions in this. So first third of pregnancy, abortion's protected. Second third, states can put regulations on it. States can totally ban abortions in the third trimester. So it depends on where you are in your pregnancy as to whether or not it was legal. And like a lot of Supreme Court precedents, this was nibbled at over the years. The Supreme Court said things like a state can pass a law saying if you're under 18, that you have to get permission from a parent or a judge or something else. They called for what were called judicial bypasses, which is, of course, a freeway around the Chief Justice's house. Legal bypass. But they didn't threaten it directly, and they followed a case from a case called Planned Parenthood versus Casey, in which Justice O'Connor wrote a decision and said, you can put limits on abortion, but only if they do not pose an undue burden. The Supreme Court loves vague things like this. What's an undue burden? An undue burden is whatever Sandra Day O'Connor and the other members of the court thought, essentially saying you can put some limits on abortion, but don't go too far and block all of them. And that had essentially been how abortion cases have been ruled on since roughly the early 1980s. Mississippi and a number of states, seeing, again, the Supreme Court had changed, Donald Trump campaigned for the presidency and promised that he would appoint pro-life judges to the Supreme Court. And then for some reason, people were shocked when he actually did it. Pay attention when people promise things, they often actually are. It was odd. So a lot of states started passing laws trying to make abortion more restricted. Texas had passed some that the Supreme Court had rejected, but once they got Justice Kavanaugh on the court and then got Justice Barrett on the court, they now had a majority to allow for much more stringent restrictions on abortion. So Mississippi, seeing that, saw an opportunity and passed something called the Gestational Age Act. And the Gestational Age Act essentially said, we're going to draw a line at 15 weeks of pregnancy. After 15 weeks of pregnancy, unless there's some really unusual circumstance like the life of the mother is in danger, no abortions after that. We're not banning all of them, but we're banning it after that particular period. And under Roe, that would have been unconstitutional because that's still within the first trimester. The Supreme Court, in taking this case, made a very radical shift from where it had been the last nearly 40 years. When states brought up restrictions on abortion, they always said, we're not trying to overturn Roe. You can still have Roe. We just want to move a little bit toward more restriction. Maybe a little bit. Maybe a little bit over here. Mississippi dropped all pretense that this was consistent with Roe and said, we want you to blow up Roe. We want you to totally get rid of Roe. And that was a very unusual thing to do, but very understandable given the change in the court. And there was a small split on the court. Justice Roberts felt that Mississippi's law should be permitted, but said, this is too dangerous to overturn Roe. It's too much of a change all at one time. We should ease into this more. This is going to cause people to think the court is illegitimate. It's going to cause problems. So they had a majority of 6 to uphold the Mississippi law. Mr. Dobbs is the head of the Department of Health. That's why his name is in there. But they had 5 to 4 to completely overturn Roe. The losing side was not happy, which we'll talk about in a minute. Even within the pro-life side of the question, Alito, Roberts, and Thomas all had very contrasting arguments. There are a number of concurrences in this case. And this is a big shift in how the conservatives on the court have established precedent about rights. It said rights that aren't explicitly stated in the constitutions have to be rooted in the nation's traditions, which is obviously a very conservative, in every sense of the word, type of approach. It says the court should be reluctant to grant new rights. And Alito, in writing the opinion, went whole hog in condemning the Roe decision, saying it had been bad. An erroneous interpretation of the Constitution is always important, but some are more damaging than others. He compares it to Plessy versus Ferguson, which, if you're a liberal, is fighting words, because Plessy versus Ferguson, other than the Dred Scott decision, which said black people can never be citizens and slavery is legal, is about the next least popular decision. Plessy is the decision that said separate but equal. States mandating segregation on the basis of race is constitutional as long as the facilities are equal. So when he picked Plessy, he's putting his finger and poking it exactly where this will be most irritating to anybody in the center and left. This is like Plessy. Roe is as bad as Plessy. and he betrayed our commitment to equality wrong, is egregiously wrong and deeply damaging, which, as you'll see, the liberals on the court did not quite agree with this. And he said, this is great. We'll have more of a democratic process now. Every state's going to be debating this. It's even good for women. Women can finally weigh in on this and say what they want. And he even went so far as to say, and this is one of the things I think he's really off about, this will help reduce tensions around abortion. I thought that was one of the more ridiculous things I've ever seen come out of a Supreme, certainly within the pro-life side, who'd always thought Roe was an undemocratic decision, that it usurped the power of states. But we've had far more tension about abortion, which has had a lot of influence on our elections and so forth. In the dissent, written, I believe it was by Sotomayor, said they've overturned this for one and only one reason, because it has always despised these precedents, and now they have the votes. The majority therefore substitutes a rule by judges for the rule of law, which is, of course, what the conservatives had said happened in Roe versus Wade. So you'll see both sides kind of throw each other's arguments at them. So what's going to come from this? First off, that's Justice Alito. He thought this was the number one decision he had come up with during the court. One thing that kind of goes against his arguments, this is going to open things up, is what this really does is dust off a lot of really old statutes. I am, as those of you who know me, am a proud Wisconsin Badger, and Wisconsin's got an abortion law. Passed 1 year after it became a state in 1849. That is now the operative abortion law for the state of Wisconsin. And if you're a little shaky on your history, that's a dozen years before the Civil War. This is not the deliberation of anything democratic by anybody who, you know, is alive, but it had been neutralized by Roe. That is now abortion law in the state of Wisconsin. Republicans are trying to modify it a little bit, but it's still the law. A lot of states have passed new restrictive laws on abortion. Some have had statewide initiatives. You may have seen that Kansas voted to preserve a right to abortion in its state constitution. Other states, and nearly every state in the South, now has a very restrictive law on abortion. So you've got an entire region of the country that has essentially wiped out legal abortion from its area. And then we have the question, what about the right to privacy? A lot of conservatives have always been unhappy about the idea that the Constitution guarantees a right to privacy. Justice Thomas, in particular, has always been very skeptical that there is any such thing as a right to privacy in the Constitution. Alito went out of his way to say, well, this doesn't affect those other decisions based on right to privacy about contraception, about same-sex marriage, about these other things. Clarence Thomas, on the other hand, could barely restrain his glee and say, see, the right to privacy is gone. We ought to look at opening up all these things. We ought to look up at getting rid of the same-sex marriage decision. We ought to get rid of the laws mandating contraception be legal. I don't think Thomas would have the votes for that, but there is certainly some sentiment on the Supreme Court to go that way, and so that's still a big controversy there. The abortion debate is going to consume a lot of government focus now and affect many elections. There was already a pushback against Republicans in the last election. As we're going to talk about in a minute, Janet Mills made this one of her major issues in running for re-election successfully against the former Governor Paul LePage. This has led to a higher level of public disapproval of the court. A large majority of the public said they did not want to see Roe overturned. And this led to some sniping between the justices themselves. Justice Kagan, not happy with the decision, said, if over time the court loses all connection with the public, which I think they have, and with public sentiment, that is a dangerous thing for democracy. Which is pretty much firing a 500-pound cannonball in Justice Alito's direction. And Justice Alito knew exactly what she was talking about. He didn't care for this. Saying or implying the court is becoming an illegitimate institution or questioning our integrity, which I think you're doing, crosses an important line. And normally the court justices don't do this stuff in public, talking about each other. You may have seen this as a sign of increasing tension. If you see that book down there, We Dissent, somebody has put in book form the dissents written in this case. Now, I don't know why you'd buy a book when you can ask Dr. Google and print them out for free on the internet, but by God, you can get a book, you know, show it off to your friends on your coffee table if they agree with you on abortion. So what's happening in Maine? Governor Mills, as we know, staunch backer of abortion rights, she expanded Medicare abortion funding, or I should say Medicaid abortion funding, made abortion rights a key part of her campaign. And this has brought up controversy now as she seeks to expand abortion rights. She had said, I'm going to leave abortion rights where they are. But when there was a case of a woman for whom she felt great sympathy, who had a very complicated pregnancy, could not get an abortion in Maine because Maine bans abortions post-viability of the fetus, flew to Colorado to get the abortion that was causing her, or it was designed to relieve her medical problems, and wants a law now that is likely to pass that says abortions after viability are legal if a physician says it's necessary. And Republicans and her other critics have said, hey, you said you were going to leave this alone. You're going way too far on this. They have talked about, if this passes, having a people's veto vote, which blocks a new law from going into effect until there has been a public vote. On the other hand, a number of states, the strategy seems to be states doing what North Carolina did in passing an abortion ban over the veto of the Democratic governor to push a 12-week limit on abortion that they see as a compromise. Okay, now we're moving into uncontroversial topics like firearms regulation. This is the biggest win for gun rights advocates since the Supreme Court started really looking at the Second Amendment in McDonald versus Chicago in 2010. For many years, the Supreme Court had followed a precedent from the late 30s, which basically said, we're really not going to interfere in government regulations on firearms. There's a compelling government interest to limit these. The Second Amendment in guaranteeing rights of arms for a militia has limits on what they're allowed to do. And so we don't have a problem with this. In McDonald, the Supreme Court said, as well as a case from DC shortly before it, that there is a right of gun ownership for home defense. Very specifically, you have a right to own a gun to defend your home. Scalia, who agreed with the decision but wrote one of his tart concurrence, like, where did you get this about? And of course, Scalia had an excellent question, as he often did. But that opened the door for more cases where the Supreme Court would say that ruling on, or that law violates the Second Amendment to the Constitution. And the New York State Rifle and Pistol Association already had won a case in which, essentially by the state abdicating, in which it said, the Supreme Court said, you have a right to carry a gun between your homes. So if you have a cabin in the Adirondacks and you live in Queens, you're legally allowed to bring that to defend your cabin. But before Bruin, every case was all based around home defense. This goes much, much further and talks about taking guns into public. It is a major departure in a more pro-gun owners direction. And it concerns something called concealed carry permits. So if you've been watching a horror movie from the 1970s called Carrie and you're walking around, some governments might make you have to have a concealed carry. As my students know, I have to have some really bad joke every 10 minutes or people become dormant. So, concealed carry means the right to carry a firearm on your person outside of your home to other sorts of places. And a business or a church can say, hey, nobody gets to bring that in our building. We have a right to say what happens in our place. But New York had always had a requirement that said, you have to show a good reason why you want one of these. You have to show cause. For example, my ex-boyfriend is violent and he's threatened to kill me. I need to have a concealed carry permit to keep myself safe from my ex-boyfriend. Or I have angered people in the mafia. Not that that would happen in New York, but I have angered, been watching on the waterfront. Look it up, kids. I've got a reason I need this. And they said, you shouldn't have a reason. This is a constitutionally protected right. It's in the Bill of Rights. I don't need no stinking reason. We don't need those stinking badges. And a lot of states had these kinds of restrictions that said, if you want a concealed carry, you got to show a good reason why you have the right to do this. But the Supreme Court overturned New York state law, said that it violated the Second Amendment. New York had had this law since its Sullivan Act of 1911. And there are people who question why they passed it. Ironically, a group of public defenders representing many minority clients said, New York has always used this law against people of color. They've always used this. Black people and other people of color are way more likely to run into trouble on the concealed carry laws. This was passed for racist reasons. We think it's problematic. On the other hand, Episcopal bishops against gun violence naturally said, no, we think this is going to lead to more damage, more people being shot. So a lot of cases where you think people would line up on the same side of the issue, it's not always quite as clean a division as you might expect. And one of the reasons why they overturned this was they said local authorities have too much discretion. They might deny you a gun permit because they don't like you, or they've got some problem, they think you're dangerous. This goes too far. So it's possible they might allow other concealed carry laws if they were more careful, if they were more precise, but they argued that it didn't. Clarence Thomas, again, has entered the chat, and Clarence Thomas says, no other right. You don't have to get advance permission for, using your Fourth Amendment rights or your Third Amendment rights if you don't want soldiers at your house. You shouldn't have to do this for the Second Amendment either. Thomas would like to go much farther in tearing these things down. However, the Supreme Court did not take a case challenging the Trump administration ban on bump stocks that was passed after the mass shooting in Las Vegas. So this was it was a big departure, but isn't necessarily opening up a broader range of attacks on gun laws. All right, so those are the 4 cases that were heard last year. How much time do I have? David? Are you entering it into your phone and calculating the minutes? All right, very good. You just yell time out, or I don't know who's got concealed carry in here, but I suppose if somebody fired a bullet through the ceiling, that would be my sign that it's time for me to shut up.
35 minutes.
Oh, golly.
Inclusive of questions.
All right. I will allow for question time. There wasn't bacon served here this morning, and maybe that was the result of the decision in National Pork Producers Council versus Ross. Bacon. And this is a case about something called the Hidden Commerce Clause. You'll sometimes see it called the Dormant Commerce Clause. The Commerce Clause gives the authority to regulate interstate commerce to Congress. And as my veteran students know, I'm exceedingly fond of the all-knowing, all-seeing, all-powerful Commerce Clause. So it's a case about pigs, but not about pork barrel spending. It's a case, I may be making a pig of myself. There's about a law passed by proposition in California. California passes more initiatives than any other state, and one of them was called the Farm Animal Confinement Initiative. It was passed in 2018, and it said any pork sold in California from sows that are mistreated, confined in a cruel manner in California laws, cannot be sold in California. And why this becomes a Commerce Clause case is over 99% of the pork sold in California is brought in from out of state, often from places like Iowa, Missouri, Illinois. And so they're passing a law. It's going to have a major impact on people trying to do business in California, and in some cases, that has led to a Commerce Clause problem. All right, hidden Commerce Clause. He's hiding behind his terminal. And there have been a lot of cases where the Supreme Court over the years has said a state can't go too far in regulating interstate commerce. The classic example is a case called Navajo Freight Lines versus Bibb from the late 50s. Illinois had a law that said any trucks operating in Illinois must have a specific mud flap size on their trucks. That was different from all 49 other states in the Union. So hypothetically, if you're driving over the border from Beloit, you had to pull over and change your mud flaps. And the Supreme Court said, can't do that. Or, bringing up my hometown, as I am wont to do, there was a case where Madison, my hometown, was trying to keep out imported milk. And by imported, I mean from Illinois. Maine is to Massachusetts what Wisconsin is to Illinois. We have all kinds of colorful nicknames for our friendly Illinois brethren. Anyway, so they were trying to keep this out. So, can't sell any milk within 15, it has to be bottled within 15 miles of Madison. You know, we can't have this milk coming from 70 miles away from Illinois. Could be tainted. Don't you have refrigerated trucks? Well, yeah, but it's from Illinois. Isn't everything from Illinois corrupt and devious? Don't ask me to answer that question. I'll take the fifth on that. And the Supreme Court said, this is obvious protectionism. There is no reason why milk from 70 miles away is a problem. You're just trying to use this to protect your own people. And that becomes very key in this decision. Because I believe it was Gorsuch that wrote the majority opinion in this case, said the reason for the Hidden Commerce Clause is to prevent protectionism, is to protect an unfair level playing field between different states and different producers. So just 2 weeks ago, the Supreme Court held for California, and his majority decision emphasized this non-discrimination. Said, look, farmers in California want to raise pigs, they got to do the same thing as farmers from Iowa that want to raise this. This isn't hurting out-of-state people. The pork producer said, well, we're going to have to change all our crates. Many pigs are raised in environments where they can't turn around, where the rails against them are very narrow. And so we're going to have to spend a lot of money to fix this, but the Supreme Court said the state of California has a right to do this because it isn't discriminatory. Kavanaugh's dissent said, well, anything California does pretty much affects interstate commerce because it's the biggest blanking state in the country. How can you say this doesn't have, to use the Wickard versus Filburn phrase, immaterial effect on interstate commerce? So that's going to be a major change. And some people, even on the left, are worried, well, what if a state passes something along the lines on abortion on this or some other sort of more conservative thing? Seems to open the door for states to put in more changes. Now I'm going to end with two cases that they have not yet ruled on. These are almost certainly going to be announced in June. The Supreme Court tends to say, you've all been to see a fireworks show, right, at some point or another? They save the big shebang for the end. That's what the Supreme Court almost always does. They save a lot of the big cases for the last few weeks in June before they go off on summer vacation. I don't know what, other than hearing emergency appeals, I don't know what they do. Some people say judges are off on fishing expeditions, and maybe they take that literally and go up to Moosehead. This is a case that's about an area that's been fought over for a long time, about affirmative action in college admissions. There are a lot of colleges that have more students that want to go to them than they have space for. And so these cases have a strong tendency to be about some of the most elite universities in the country. Or things like medical schools and law schools that are highly competitive to get in. And we've seen a lot of these cases dating back to the Bakke case in the late 70s, which said you can't have racial quotas or gender quotas. You can make it one factor. You can say that's one thing we'll look at. We want a more diverse school, but you can't say there's 10 chairs and they all have to go to African Americans, or 10 chairs that all have to go to women. And over time, the Supreme Court has been nibbling away at that to make it harder to practice affirmative action. And most recently, in the Grutter versus Bollinger cases from the University of Michigan, they said, you can use this as one factor, but you have to have a really good reason for doing them. And that would be something that would take minutes to explain, so I'm going to move on. This case is unique in that they're arguing that it specifically discriminates against Asian American applicants. Harvard has a higher percentage of Asian Americans in its student body than their place in the population. And generally, affirmative action is designed to increase representation of the underrepresented. And schools like Harvard have said, we don't need to use affirmative action for Asian admissions anymore. They are already clearly well represented. Other groups are the ones that really need the help. The reason this case is at the court is this man down at the lower left, a man named Edward Bloom, who is a conservative, super legal activist who has funded a lot of expensive challenges against what he sees as unfair racial privileges for non-white people. He backed the famous election case, Shelby County versus Holder, the Fisher versus University of Texas cases about affirmative action at the University of Texas. And if the Supreme Court rules as I think they do, I think they're going to finally cut off the use of race in any form in college admissions. And one of the things many people point out is colleges use all kinds of things besides your GPA. Lots of schools have legacy admissions where, gee, your dad was Harold Alfond and he gave a whole lot of money to rebuild our, well, we can't not let an Alfond into school, or you're a really good football player, we want you in, or you're a great flute player or a great artist. colleges have always used various means to give people admission that aren't based purely on GPA or test scores. This would remove race from being one of those. We know this would be very likely to lead to a great decrease in people of color in colleges, which is what happened at the University of Texas after they eliminated their affirmative action programs of that nature. And finally, it's time for dessert, or more specifically about cake. Going to talk about the sequel to the Masterpiece Cake case, or the Masterpiece Cake Shop case. These are both cases from Colorado, and they both concern the rights of private business people against the rights of LGBT plus people. The Masterpiece Cake case got a lot of attention a few years ago. It involved these two men who had gotten married in New Jersey, but wanted to celebrate their wedding back in Colorado, where one of them is from, at a time before Colorado had same-sex marriage. And they went to this man who operated a place called the Masterpiece Cake Shop. And they said, hey, we want a cake that celebrates my marrying this other man. And he said, look, you can buy any cake in the store. I'm not discriminating against you because you're gay. You can buy anything in the store, but if you're asking me to make the cake, now you're compelling me to do something I don't believe in. He said, there's a lot of things I wouldn't make a cake for. I wouldn't make a cake for the Ku Klux Klan. I wouldn't make a cake celebrating Halloween because I have Christian religious problems with celebrating demons and spirits and jumbo-sized Snicker bars or whatever else it is. There's a whole lot of things I wouldn't make, and you can't compel me to do that. And of course, they did the American thing and sued. The state of Colorado said, you violated their rights under our anti-gay discrimination law. And the Supreme Court kind of ducked the question. The Supreme Court likes to duck questions. They especially like to duck making big constitutional pronouncements on things under a doctrine called the doctrine of constitutional avoidance, which essentially says, if we can kill this with like a little tap instead of bringing out a jackhammer, we would prefer to do it. And they said, we're going to rule for Masterpiece because Colorado said so many anti-religious things in their ruling, they showed malicious intent. Doesn't apply to any other case, but we're ruling for him just this time. Well, you knew somebody else was going to come up with a case. And we knew someone was going to come up with a case. And the case involves this woman behind 303 Creative called Lori Smith. Lori Smith is also a conservative Christian who has a moral disagreement with same-sex marriage, sees it as against God's law, and she's building websites for weddings. You probably have seen, if you had a friend get married, they've got like, here are the pictures, here's where our gift registry is. And she wanted to put a sign on her website that said, if you're going to hire me, I won't do it for a same-sex wedding. And the state of Colorado told her, you can't do that. That violates our state law, much as we thought this was. She has argued this is government-compelled speech, and it's generally very hard for government to compel speech. For example, in the 1940s, the Supreme Court held that Jehovah's Witnesses who objected to the Pledge of Allegiance could not be compelled to recite it. The government is usually not in a position of saying, you have to write a message in a particular way. And she said, well, that's what they're doing in my case. They are trying to compel me to say something because my engagement in putting up a website violates my ability to express things. They can buy, any other website. They want to put up a website about a class reunion. I'm not discriminating against them as individuals, but I can't do something that violates my own policies, and the state has said, we have anti-gay discrimination laws. Your free exercise is limited in this case. You're not allowed to say, I won't serve this broad category of people. And Jack Phillips, the Masterpiece guy, is already in court with Colorado again because he continues to refuse to make same-sex marriage cakes. Nobody's suing him about the Halloween cakes, but that's what's going on. This is my favorite picture. I always end with this picture. This is Justice Breyer with a group of people who apparently have gotten admission. No, it's a bunch of kids. They're all wearing Cat in the Hat. Justice Breyer is reading The Cat in the Hat to a group of students. Probably more interesting than your average Supreme Court ruling. But he's telling stories, clearly enjoying it. Probably more fun than issuing rulings on abortion or gun cases where no matter what you do, some people will think you're evil. But at this point, I've told all the stories of that, and I think we have some time now for questions. David, do you want to call on people, or should I do so?
You should do so.
Yes.
So going back to the flagpole.
Yes.
Supposing the Ku Klux Klan or the Nazi Party or the Proud Boys wanted to put up a flag, are they going to be able to do so?
That's a difficult question, because what none of those groups have is the free exercise right that the church group did, because none of them are doing what they're doing based on a religious belief. On the other hand, it's clearly content-based discrimination. I would argue that probably the city of Boston would have to allow them to do that unless they could prove these are groups involved in the case of the Proud Boys, people who were involved in the insurrection, that you could say if this is a criminal enterprise, if this is a group dedicated to violating the law, that might give them an out, largely because the religion element is missing. But other groups that have unpopular political views, I think clearly would. I think that's a case that would wind up going before the court. We've had cases where the Nazi Party has been given the right to march in parades. There's a famous case in Skokie, Illinois, a very heavily Jewish suburb of Chicago that had, at the time, many Holocaust survivors. It never made it to the Supreme Court, but the federal court said, if you say the Nazis can't march because they're Nazis, that's viewpoint-based discrimination. The Nazis have to be given the right to march. Then, of course, the Nazis were complete chicken stuff about it and never actually held them out. Oh, we just wanted to go to court and waste everybody's time. I think it would be difficult to ban a group unless you could say they're connected to a criminal enterprise. So I think the city of Boston I think there's a good chance they'd have to. I suspect the city of Boston would go back to court to prevent that. But because of the lack of a free exercise right, they'd be in a stronger position than they were in this case. Great question. Yes, sir.
What do you make out of the intention to add 4 justices proposed by, I think, the left?
Yeah. Well, there's a couple ways we can look at that. All of which drive me to drinking. First off, would it be constitutionally permissible? The answer is yes. Franklin Roosevelt tried to do this in his famous court packing plan in 1937, which backfired on him horribly. His own party revolted. It's about the time his own popularity went down. But the Supreme Court's number of members is not spelled out in the Constitution. So could you add? You could. But the Supreme Court has not changed its numbers since shortly after the Civil War. I think that it's a poor idea to expand the size of the Supreme Court. The reason I think it's a poor idea, if you're doing it for purely ideological reasons, it's very clear that a lot of the impetus for this is from liberals who don't like recent decisions, just like Franklin Roosevelt didn't like a lot of his New Deal plans being shot down in Schechter Poultry and those other cases, is that any other president from a different party will then try and do the same thing. That if you put 4 Democratic judges on the court, first off, I don't think Mitch McConnell would be terribly eager to hear those sorts of things. I think he'd be a snapping turtle about that kind of stuff. But imagine a new President Trump, or a President DeSantis, or a President Haley, that you're suddenly now going to have a situation where every president is going to try to add seats to the Supreme Court. It's going to become unwieldy. The Supreme Court functions as well as it does because it's a small body. It can be a deliberative body. I think it's dangerous politics to add to it. Now, I do agree with President Biden that there is something that would make more sense to look at, and that is some sort of term limits for Supreme Court justices. All federal judges are appointed for what is called life and good behavior, which means we can pull you if you commit a crime, do something bad, you're caught in bribery. By the same process, you can remove a president or anybody else subject to Senate confirmation. And President Biden has suggested, okay, we're not saying you couldn't be reappointed, but perhaps after 18 years on the court, you should have to be reconfirmed, that we should get another shot at you. I'd be more willing to consider that as a means of change. The Supreme Court is designed to be a conservative institution, but I think increasing the size would be ideologically fraught. I'd be much more interested in that kind of consideration, but I'm absolutely against adding seats to the Supreme Court. Yes, our new UMF student.
So I'm just thinking about all the precedent that these cases.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm wondering if you can think theoretically.
Oh, okay. I was worried where that was going to end. I was wondering if I could think. Go ahead.
So I'm just wondering if you can think of any way that precedent that these cases would set would be affecting future cases.
I think they all do. One of the things we're certainly looking at, for example, on the gun case, is how far will the Supreme Court go down that road? What if a town said, there was a town in Georgia a few years ago, for example, it said, everybody in town must own a handgun. They were responding to a town called Morton Groves in suburban Chicago, which said, nobody can have a handgun. And they said, well, hold my grits, I'm about to put in this thing that says everybody has to have that. Well, how would that influence that? So obviously the door is open to more permission for guns. Obviously the abortion ruling opens the door for a very broad range of restrictions on abortion. One question could be, would they accept something like Texas's law where they essentially allow people to report as vigilantes for a reward, people helping someone get an abortion? Would they go that far? But certainly the precedent's been established. States can do way more to restrict abortion than they could before. The Shurtleff case establishes the idea that governments aren't establishing religion if they're allowing for a free, broad forum. I don't think there's any of these cases that don't establish a broader precedent, but the abortion ruling in particular establishes a precedent that is unlikely to change for a very long time. And the other point is it not only establishes new precedent, but it also opens the door to governments to do things. I think one of the things that's underrated about what the Supreme Court does is to show other governments what they can do. Hey, you thought you couldn't pass a law about allowing for more guns like this? Hey, now you can. You thought you couldn't pass these restrictions on abortion? Well, now you can. But the abortion one in particular is a really dramatic precedent. All of these cases, I think do. The one that probably establishes the least precedent is Carson versus Macon, because the Maine case is so unique to Maine. There are so few other states where this would be an issue. However, even using Carson, which I would say is probably the least precedential value of any of these cases beyond what we call the instant case, which sounds like something you spooned out of a jar, just means the case we're talking about. Some other states might say, well, if those kids have a right to a private school, why don't other students that do have a public high school, why don't they have a right to do so? Why shouldn't somebody who lives in Skowhegan get money from the state to go to St. Dominic's? Or why shouldn't somebody who's going to school in Freeport, even though they've got a high school, why shouldn't they get money to go to Chevres? So even cases you don't think establish new precedents open up possibilities. Yes?
Just a follow-up question.
Sure.
Talking about like how this could be set to make it so that people who can go to high school normally could get funding to go to private school. Do you think that this in the future could be used in a case to support funding for attending college?
No, because colleges currently do make grants to religious authorities now. So for example, if I wanted to go to Notre Dame, Catholic University, or Marquette, or St. Joe's. If I wanted to go to a religious school right now, there is no such government restriction on that kind of funding. You can get government money to do those things. In religion cases, the Supreme Court has always distinguished between adults and children, and sometimes comes up with things that seem contradictory. For example, the Maine legislature opens each day with a prayer given by a different clergy person from a different part of the state. It's always a big honor to be asked to do that. A school couldn't do that. A school couldn't say, we're going to bring in a different rabbi to lead our school in prayer today. It would violate, about 60 years of Supreme Court precedent. But Congress has an official chaplain paid for by government dollars, because adults are treated very, very differently. So for colleges, I don't think it would have much of an impact, because governments have always been free to support religious education of adults in a way they are not with children. Great question. Yes. Hi.
Professor Melcher.
Yes.
I agree with you that it's really important to have respectful discourse and civil discourse when we talk about these really, really divisive issues.
Absolutely.
And when we're talking about the Supreme Court, the decisions they make all through history can affect millions and millions and millions of people.
Of course.
Sometimes in really, egregious ways, sometimes in positive ways. And so, I mean, I personally, when I don't go dormant if I don't have a joke every 5 minutes or.
All right. Then you're atypical, but go ahead.
Well, I just turned 75. You mentioned that you have a big birthday.
60.
At my age, I remember all of these. I remember from Brown, Board of Education.
1954.
I remember the Public Accommodations Act. I stood and watched Kennedy's funeral corset. So, this is when I see at my age all of what I thought were progress in, expanding rights for women's reproductive rights, which also affect men too, or are good for men.
Of course.
Civil rights, educational rights. I look at these students here, particularly women, and I know when I was in college watching the rights, where you couldn't even get a prescription for birth control in Massachusetts in the 60s, but then, we're okay. So this is really, really serious. And you were talking, you mentioned the Supreme Court, all these people on the Supreme Court through the years, and also the fact that they are appointed by presidents. But the fact is, these people, every single one of them is approved and confirmed by the Senate.
Yes, they are.
That's how they get on there. And, we can be bipartisan, and I will be bipartisan, but, I mean, this is a huge responsibility. And my question to you is, where do you think senators have both a moral and a responsibility for not only their vote, but the consequences of their vote? And, I look at President Biden, who I actually support most of the time. What if he, when he was, chairman of the Judiciary Committee during the Clarence Thomas, if he had allowed the other women to come in and corroborate what Anita Hill was saying, and it was a very close vote, he might not have even gotten out of committee. And you see the consequences of him. I look at Kavanaugh, I'm sorry, we have to do that. And I look at Margaret Chase Smith, and the reason why all of us have been coming through the years and we honor her is not because of, individual votes, but because of her declaration of conscience. Because she stood up for what was right. She had the political courage to do that. She specifically criticized her own party and was willing to take the political consequences for it. And, I think that's something we should be talking about. And, when we're talking about reproductive rights and gun control, and stuff like these poor families down in Uvalde yesterday, these are really serious issues. And the senators who vote for these people, bear, what responsibility do you think they share in the consequences?
I'll get to the second part of that question, but there's something you said earlier I want to react to first, about the idea that talking about cases where courts have taken rights away, which is a lot of what the dissenters in the Dobbs case argued. They said, look, when else has the Supreme Court taken away something that they articulated was a constitutionally guaranteed right? And there aren't that many cases where courts have. And that was a lot of what Roberts was trying to say in saying, you're going too far in overturning this completely. I'm willing to go along with this, but there are consequences to having such a large reversal in direction. Of course, obviously, there are many reversals in direction that you cite in the opposite direction. Brown was certainly a major reversal. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Fair Housing Act of 1968 were also reversals. So there are adjustments, whether you're a liberal or a conservative, anytime you get policy change. But I thought both Roberts had a point and the dissenters on the abortion case had a point that it's dangerous for the Supreme Court to move too quickly in one particular direction, that it doesn't allow people to adjust. But what I was going to say is, we see this in policy, though, in a lot of cases. We've seen cases where, for example, under President Clinton, people who had been entitled to receive welfare wound up having those rights taken away, whether you agree with the policy or don't agree with the policy. Something people had come to expect as a right was taken away by the government and changed. There are lots of cases outside of the courts where just in terms of policy, things change. President Reagan certainly tried to roll back various rights of protecting the environment and protecting other sorts of things. So I think that this isn't quite as new as that would sound. The second part of that question is a trickier one in some ways, to say what their responsibility is. I would like to see, it depends on, I tend to think, I'm going to give an answer I don't think you're going to like. So I'm buckling up for this now. I tend to think competent judges and other competent presidential appointees should be confirmed regardless of their ideology. I think it's something that when the public votes for a president, that's one of the things that people know they are getting. And I think anybody, and I heard hundreds say, oh, I didn't know Donald Trump was going to appoint those kind of people to the court. You aren't paying attention. He's been saying this for a long, you've got to mobilize and make better arguments. Hey, we don't want to see women's rights roll back this far. We don't want to make this go in that direction. But that's the time to make a lot of those arguments. I would say in Kavanaugh's case, I think he should not have been confirmed because I don't believe he demonstrated the kind of maturity that, of being a judge that kind of person does. I tend not to agree with the idea of taking somebody completely, and you could make certainly an argument that Clarence Thomas's behavior around women should have been something that people could have looked at more closely. I don't believe in voting against a judicial nominee because they're conservative. I'm on the Democratic side of things more than the Republican side. I would have voted to confirm Gorsuch, even though I would have known he would have done a lot of things very differently than I did, but he had no kinds of moral questions, no kinds of questions of temperament, clearly well qualified. He would vote against me on most major cases, but I would have voted to confirm Gorsuch. I wouldn't have voted to confirm Kavanaugh because of his standing, and I think Senator Collins made a good argument for voting against Barrett, which was to say, how can you say, that's the thing that really made me angry, was the majority leader making a statement, you should never confirm a judge in an election year. And then turning around doing precisely the opposite under the most flimsy of justifications to say, well, we couldn't let Merrick Garland be on the court in the last year of Obama's term, but we can let Barrett in. I think that's frank hypocrisy, and I think that's a terrible policy for them to follow. But I don't, you know, people can make an argument as impassioned as yours on the other side of the issue. Thank God the court is finally protecting the unborn, or thank God they're standing up for the Second Amendment. I prefer to keep the ideology as much out of it and talk about their competence.
You're assuming that I'm speaking on ideology.
Well, have I made an ass of you and me?
Character, and I'm also talking about, you know, these are political votes.
Of course.
You know, Amy Coney Barrett was going to be confirmed anyway.
Yeah.
She had the vote.
But I don't think she should have been.
But okay, so you can vote against her. They did not have the votes for Kavanaugh. Those votes counted. You know, just as like Thomas, it was a very close vote for him. And maybe, you know, the vote could have gone differently. That's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the political calculations. These are not, you know, coming out of the sky rulings. These are political judgments that senators make and decisions, unless you have somebody who's very unique, like Senator Margaret Chase Smith, who are willing to just say, this is what's right. So that's what, but you know, I'm not for strict ideology either. So.
Well, there's also the question of whether Kavanaugh was truthful with Senator Collins and other people. Yeah. And I honestly would question whether he was. She has put it down as a marker for a long, long time. I would not vote for somebody who'd overturn Roe. And she was very clearly convinced from talking to Kavanaugh that he was. Now, part of the problem of having judges make specific comments is you don't want this to be like a campaign promise. the Senate hearings for confirmations have become a real sham because nobody wants to answer any questions remotely directly because they don't want to look like they're campaigning and they don't want to set a precedent for themselves that they have to follow later. But I certainly understand where you're coming from on that, and I'm seeing a room full of hands, so I think yes, in the back. I hope that answered your question. Yes.
So I just wanted you to elaborate a little bit on how you think the precedent set by Roe being overturned would affect other things under the right to privacy, contraception, interracial marriage, same-sex marriage,
Yeah.
things that's really important to talk about.
That's a great question. If you couldn't hear her from the back, the question was, how will the Dobbs ruling that overturned Roe affect other rights that are contingent on the idea of a right to privacy? Just as a refresher, the right to privacy was first declared by the court in 1965 in a case involving contraception in Connecticut. Massachusetts had its own case about contraception for unmarried people come up 7 years later, and the court said that's covered by privacy also. That's a very good question. It's interesting that Thomas did not raise interracial marriage as one of those. I wasn't trying to be clever, but Clarence Thomas is a black man married to a white woman, and he left loving out. It's hard to imagine any state messing with interracial marriage at this point. However, I think some things might be, I think certainly same-sex marriage, the way the court ruled on it, would be in much more of the firing line. It's difficult to imagine politically any state banning contraception today, but there would still be a lot of political will in a lot of states to not follow same-sex marriage. The Supreme Court established in Obergefell that the right to privacy, among other things, said that not only do states have to honor same-sex marriage from other states, they have to provide their own same-sex marriage, even if they wouldn't want to. And Congress, of course, while President Biden had a Democratic Congress, voted to uphold the first part of that, which is constitutionally sounder because it's based on the full faith and credit clause, which says states honor agreements from other states. My wife and I got married in Ohio. We didn't have to have a new marriage ceremony the minute we crossed the bridge in Kittery and have to do that. I don't have to change. That part is going to be pretty hard to get rid of based on the congressional legislation. But I would say of any of the right to privacy guarantees, the one that could be in the most danger based on this ruling, and Thomas is clearly really eager to take a case that would do it, is the ruling in Obergefell that states have to honor same-sex marriages from other, or the states have to establish their own procedures for same-sex marriage. Many states had constitutional language. Ohio, the state that was the main focus of Obergefell, had just passed a constitutional amendment that said marriage is one man versus one woman. This isn't legislation. This is in our state constitution as a permanent element. Constitutional law is relatively permanent law. I think there are many states that if they got a sense from the court that would allow them not to have their own same-sex marriage, I think that there are a lot of states that would try. I think there are many states, a lot of the same states that are looking to ban abortion, I think would do. I would say that would be the one that's in the most danger. I don't see the political will for the rest of them, and I don't think Thomas really speaks for the rest of the court in saying he wants to take a fresh look at these things. Alito went out of, and Alito, if you've not paid attention to him, is not exactly one of the most liberal members of the court. Alito went out of his way. Look, I'm not trying to say I want to get rid of same-sex marriage or contraception or those things. I don't think the court will ever have the votes to completely overturn most of those things, but requiring states to have their own same-sex marriage, I think, is the one piece that I think could be vulnerable. Because the full faith and credit clause wouldn't protect that in the way it protects a marriage from another state. Okay. Yes?
Time's up.
Aw, I was just getting warmed up.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Jim.
David. Thank you very much.